There are moments in a man's life when the ground shifts beneath him so completely that he cannot tell in the first few seconds whether what he is feeling is fear or clarity. I know now that it was clarity. It was 11:47 at night. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a deed transfer agreement open in front of me, a yellow legal pad to my right, and a phone that had just buzzed with a message from a number I did not recognize. The area code was 602. The message read, "Mr. Delgado. This is Patricia Walsh from Southwestern Mortgage Services. I am trying to reach you regarding a home equity application associated with your property address." I set the phone down. I looked at the ceiling above me, the ceiling I had built with my own hands in 1996, smooth and solid, the way I had always built things. And I understood in the specific way that a structural engineer understands when a load path has been compromised, that someone had been using my house as collateral for a debt I knew nothing about. Let me tell you what I did next. I did not panic. I did not call my son. I did not go down the hallway and confront anyone. I picked up my pen, and I began to write. If you are watching this and something in your own life feels wrong, if the foundation beneath a relationship or an agreement or a promise has shifted in a way you cannot quite name, stay with me. Because what happened next changed everything. And it started with a single decision to document the truth before anyone had the chance to rewrite it. My name is Frank Delgado. I am 65 years old. I spent 35 years as a licensed structural engineer in Phoenix, Arizona, and before that I built the house I am sitting in right now by hand, from the foundation up in the summer and fall of 1996. What you are about to hear is a dramatized account of real events. Names and certain details have been changed to protect the people involved. But the bones of this story are true. The structural integrity of what I am about to tell you has not been compromised. Before I continue, I want to ask you one thing. Leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what city, what state, what country. The reason I ask is this. The lessons in this story are not mine alone. Every time you engage, every comment, and every share, this account reaches another family, another grandfather, another person who needs to hear that the foundation can hold even when someone has tried to take it from them. Now, let me tell you how we got to that table. I am not a man who panics when he sees a crack. 35 years as a structural engineer trained me out of that early. When you see a crack, you measure it. You document it. You determine whether it is cosmetic or load-bearing, whether it has been there for decades or appeared overnight, whether it is the kind of thing you monitor or the kind of thing you fix immediately. Panic is not part of the process. Assessment is. So, when my daughter-in-law looked across the Thanksgiving table and said, "Frank, maybe people your age should learn to stay in their lane," I did not panic. I set down my fork. I looked at her across the table I had built by hand in 2001 in the house I had designed, and built myself in 1996 in the city I had chosen and lived in for 30 years. I looked at her the way I look at a structural problem I have already solved, and I smiled. Not the kind of smile she expected, the kind that comes from a man who already knows exactly how the story ends. Because by the time she said those words, I had already filed the civil petition. I had already retained the attorney. I had already documented every crack, every shifted load, every forged signature. The game she thought she was still playing had ended weeks before she realized it had begun. But I need to take you back to where it started, because a crack does not appear on the day you notice it. It begins long before that, in the settling, in the shifting, in the small stresses that accumulate over time until the surface finally shows what the structure has been carrying for months. The story of what I am going to call a calculated family betrayal begins in October, 6 weeks before Thanksgiving. It begins in my garage with a manila folder in the wrong place. I want to tell you about the house before I tell you the rest of the story, because the house is not the setting. The house is the subject. I drew the plans in the winter of 1995, not hired plans my own. I had been a licensed structural engineer for 11 years by then, and I had spent those years calculating load paths and specifying connections and reviewing other people's designs, and I had always known that when I built my own house, I would draw it myself. Every line, every dimension, every material specification. The kitchen smelled like pencil shavings and coffee. During those planning months, Elena, my wife, would bring me a fresh cup somewhere around 9 in the evening, set it on the corner of the drafting table without saying anything, and go back to whatever she was reading. The coffee was always the same dark roast, no sugar temperature, just below scalding, the way I had been drinking it since my first job site at 26. After she passed 11 years ago, I kept making it the same way. Some habits are structural. You do not remove them without redistributing the load. Elena sat with me at the kitchen table of our rental apartment for 6 weekends while I drew. She brought coffee and asked questions, not to help, but because she was genuinely interested in understanding how a building worked, which was one of the many things I loved about her. She asked why I was making the hallway wider than standard. I told her that in 30 years, if either of us needed a walker or a wheelchair, a standard hallway would feel like a constraint. She was 38 years old and in perfect health when I said that. She laughed. Then she said, "Put it in the plans." I pulled the permit in March of 1996. I hired a crew for the foundation and framing work that requires more hands than one man can manage, and I did everything else myself. Electrical rough-in, plumbing rough-in, insulation, drywall, finish work. Every weekend for 8 months. The smell of fresh drywall compound in the summer heat, the particular grit of concrete dust that settles in the creases of your hands, no matter how many times you wash them, the way a level reads true, when a wall is perfectly plumb, a small, precise satisfaction that never gets old after 35 years. Miguel was 8 years old that summer. Elena brought him to the site on Saturdays. He handed me screws and held the flashlight when I needed both hands. In November, when we moved in, he found a hammer in the garage and walked the whole house tapping on walls. I asked him what he was doing. He said he was checking if they were solid. I told him that was a good instinct. That was the house. When Brooke moved in 18 months ago, when the deed transfer was complete, and Miguel and Brooke relocated from their apartment in Tempe, I understood that the house would change. I am not sentimental about surfaces. Paint colors, furniture, decorative choices. These are cosmetic. They do not affect the structure. I told myself I could accommodate cosmetic changes. What I found when I walked through the living room in October was not cosmetic. The brown leather sofa Elena and I had owned for 19 years was gone. In its place, a white sectional with chrome legs and cushions that looked like they had been chosen for a photograph rather than a life. Above the sofa, where Elena's Sonoran desert photograph had hung since the year we moved in there, was an abstract canvas in gray and copper, competently executed, completely anonymous. Elena's photograph was not in the room. The copper pots that had hung above the kitchen island since 2001 were gone. I found them later in a box in the garage wrapped in paper. I stood in the living room doorway and did what I do. When I encounter a site that has been altered without my involvement, I assessed. I noted what had been removed, what had been added, what had been changed. I noted the quality of the changes, not whether I liked them, but whether they had been done correctly. They had not always been done correctly. I walked down the hallway. Near the entrance to the bedroom wing at a height of approximately 42 inches from the floor, there was a pencil line on the wall. Faint horizontal, about 2 inches long. Elena had put it there in November of 1998, marking Miguel's height at age 10. I had watched her do it. She had written the date beside it in her small, precise handwriting. Brooke had painted the hallway sometime in the past 18 months. The new paint stopped approximately 1 inch short of the pencil line. The line was still there. I put my finger on it. Some materials hold longer than you expect them to if you leave them alone. I noticed the ceiling crack on a Tuesday morning in early November, 11 days after I found the deed folder in the wrong location. It ran along the joist line in the living room, 14 inches, starting as a hairline at the east end and widening to approximately 1/4 inch at the west end, where it terminated above an opening that Brooks' contractor had created 3 months earlier, when he removed the wall between the living room and what had been the study. I knew that wall. I had specified it in the original drawings. It was a load-bearing partition carrying approximately 480 pounds per linear foot from the roof structure above. It required a properly sized header beam at the opening. The contractor had not installed one. I crouched down and looked at the crack from below. Then I stood on a step stool and looked at it from closer range. The joist had deflected slightly, no more than 1/8 of an inch, but measurable at the point of highest stress concentration. The crack in the drywall surface was the ceiling's record of that deflection. It had been recording it quietly for approximately 3 months. Elena would have said, "Are you going to fix it?" I would have said yes, but first I need to understand why it happened. She would have said, "I already know why it happened," because someone who did not know what they were doing removed a wall that was holding something up. She would have been right. That is the thing about structural integrity in buildings and in people. The damage rarely announces itself. It accumulates quietly in the places where the load has been shifted to structures not designed to carry it until the surface finally shows what has been happening underneath. What I was looking at on that Tuesday morning in November was not just a crack in my ceiling. It was the first visible evidence of something that had been calculated with a precision I had not yet fully understood. I retrieved my measurement log from the garage, a green hardcover notebook I had maintained since 1996, and added a new entry. November the 6th, living room ceiling crack, east-west orientation joist line, 14 inches, hairline to 0.25 inches. Cause missing header at new opening load redistribution. Then I heard Lily. She was 4 years old, and she was on the hallway floor with a collection of wooden blocks, narrating the construction of what she had decided was a fire station. She looked up when she saw me. I went to the garage. In the back corner of a wooden crate that had not been opened in several years, I found a piece of the original framing stock from 1996. White oak, 4 inches by 4 inches, cut to approximately 6 inches in length. Dense, smooth on the cut ends. It weighed more than it looked like it should. I brought it to Lily and set it on the floor beside her blocks. I told her it was from the frame of the house. I told her it had been holding things up since before she was born. I told her it was a foundation piece, the kind you put down first, before anything else, because everything else rests on it. She picked it up with both hands, turned it over once, and placed it at the base of her structure. Then Brooke came around the corner. She stopped when she saw the oak block. She said it was a safety concern. Rough edges, splinters, not appropriate for a child. She picked it up from Lily's structure, walked to the kitchen and placed it in the trash can under the sink. She did it efficiently, without anger, the way you discard something that has been correctly identified as not belonging. Lily watched the block go. I watched Brooke's hands on the cabinet door as she closed it. An engineer learns to read a structure by what it does under load. What I had just watched was not about a block of wood. It was about a pattern, the same pattern as the moved folder, the removed photograph, the packed away copper pots, the wall taken down without a header. A systematic removal of load-bearing references, one by one, quietly, efficiently. The betrayal of a family's legacy does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives like this: a folder moved 2 shelves to the right, a photograph wrapped in paper and put in a box, a piece of a man's life's work placed in a trash can under a kitchen sink. Small cuts, each one individually dismissible, collectively describing something that a structural engineer would recognize immediately. A premeditated load redistribution. I went back to the garage and opened the measurement log to a new page. Then I went to my desk and began searching for a property and family law attorney in Phoenix, Arizona. The dinner hour changed in the second week of November. It was not announced. Announcements imply consultation. This was simply a fact that arrived one evening. Dinner was at 7:30 now, not 6. I discovered it at 6:15 when I came to the kitchen and found it empty, the stovetop cold, the air carrying the faint smell of a meal that would not be prepared for another hour. I made a sandwich and ate it at the kitchen table alone, listening to the sound of the house settle in the cooling evening air, the particular tick and creak of a wood frame structure, releasing the thermal expansion of the day, a sound I had been hearing for 30 years, and that I found more honest than most human conversation. The following week, there was a housewarming gathering. 12 people I did not know, colleagues of Brooke's from her business, arriving at 7 and staying until past 11. I was not told about it until the afternoon of the day it occurred. At one point, I heard Brooke in the living room describing the house to someone. She said, "And the bones are great. It just needed updating." The bones. I did not go out and correct her. I went to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the wide window above the sink for a few minutes watching the yard in the dark. The December night air outside carried the mineral smell of the desert after a day of cold, dry, and clean, and indifferent to everything happening inside the house. I let it settle in my chest for a moment. Then I went back to my room and made a voice memo on my phone. I had been making voice memos since the second week of October after I found the deed folder out of place. By the end of November, I had 31 memos. I labeled each one by date and subject the way I labeled field observation notes on a job site. Date, location, observation, relevant context. A structural survey is not useful as a single data point. It is useful as a pattern. You take readings over time, and you watch for the direction of change. Individual readings can be anomalous. Patterns do not lie. On the third Saturday of November, I was in the kitchen at 6 in the morning, my habitual hour, and I heard Brooke on the phone in the study. The door was not fully closed. I was not trying to listen. I was making coffee, and her voice carried. She was talking about the house. She used the phrase, "an asset that is currently not performing." She used the phrase, "the residency clause is the complication." She said, "We deal with the complication first, then we move forward." I stood at the coffee maker and listened without moving. She said one more thing before the conversation ended. She said, "He's 65 years old. He doesn't have to be a problem forever." I poured my coffee. I carried it to the table. I sat down. The bitterness of that particular morning's coffee. Dark roast. No sugar temperature, just below scalding. Stayed with me. In a way that coffee usually does not. There are moments when the body records something the mind is still processing. I noted the date, the time 6:14 in the morning, and I repeated as precisely as I could into my phone every word I had heard. Then I drank my coffee and watched the morning come through the window. Some loads, once you understand their source, are much easier to manage. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, Brooke told me she was limiting my time with Lily. She did not say it that way. She said it the way people say things they do not want to be held accountable for, with enough qualifications and reasonable-sounding explanations that the actual content becomes difficult to argue against directly. She said Lily was at a sensitive developmental stage. She said consistency in Lily's routine was important. She said it standing in the kitchen doorway in the morning between me and the coffee maker, in the tone of a person delivering information rather than making a request. I listened to the full explanation. Then I said, "Understood." That was all I said. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I said, "Understood," poured my coffee, and went to the garage. I sat on the workbench for a few minutes. The garage smelled of concrete dust and machine oil, and the faint cedar of the storage boxes Elena had bought at a market in Tucson in 2004, a smell I associated with order, with a space governed by function rather than social calculation. I thought about Lily, 4 years old, building things on the floor and narrating them to herself, holding a piece of white oak with the seriousness of a person who understood that some objects carry more weight than their size suggests. The structural integrity of a legacy is not measured by its size. It is measured by what it passes on, and to whom, and whether the transmission holds. That evening I was in the hallway when I heard Lily's voice from the living room. She was building her fire station and describing it as she built. I sat on the floor a few feet away and watched her work. After a few minutes, she handed me a block without looking up. I placed it where the structural logic of the design indicated it should go at the base of the tower section, which was showing signs of lateral instability. Lily assessed my placement, decided it was correct, and handed me another block. We worked like that for 40 minutes without much conversation. It was the best 40 minutes of that week. At one point, Brooke came through the living room. She said in a light tone that carried a different message underneath. "I thought we talked about the routine," Lily said without looking up. "Grandpa is helping with the load-bearing section." Brooke went to the kitchen. After Lily went to bed, I made a voice memo. I noted the date, the conversation about limiting my time with Lily, the language Brooke had used, the evening's events. And I noted that Lily had used the phrase load-bearing section with complete accuracy and appropriate context. Then I said into the phone in the quiet of the garage, "I am going to fix this." I ended the memo and went inside. I met James Whitfield at Central Hardware on Southern Avenue on a Saturday morning in the third week of November. He was at the lumber desk asking about L-Vel beam specifications for a residential header application. I was waiting to ask about cedar planks. I heard his question and recognized it as the question of someone who understood what he was asking. When he finished, I said, "What's the span?" He turned and looked at me. I told him I was a retired structural engineer and had used LVL headers in residential applications for 30 years. He told me the span. I told him the minimum specification he needed. He wrote it down. His name was James Whitfield. 31 years as a licensed appraiser, certified in residential and commercial properties, a member of the Appraisal Institute. Semi-retired, but still taking cases that interested him. We talked over coffee at a sandwich shop 2 doors down from the hardware store. I told him about the house. Not everything, not the voice memos or the overheard phone call. I told him I had transferred the deed to my son and daughter-in-law 18 months ago, with a residency clause under Section 8, Paragraph 4, prohibiting use of the property as collateral without my written consent, and that I had recently become concerned about certain activities related to the property. He set down his coffee. He said, "Has anyone run a title search on the property recently?" I said I did not know. He said he could run one. He said it would show any liens, encumbrances, or financing instruments recorded against the property in the past 2 years. I asked him what he would charge. He said, "Let me do the preliminary search first. If there's nothing there, I'll charge you nothing, and we'll both feel better." I looked at him for a moment. 31 years as an engineer had given me a reasonable ability to assess whether a person's stated intentions matched their actual ones. James Whitfield's matched. I gave him the property address. We shook hands. I drove home. That evening, I made a voice memo. I described the meeting, James's credentials, the title search, the preliminary timeline. I noted that if the title search revealed financing instruments I had not consented to, that would constitute a violation of Section 8, Paragraph 4 of the Deed Transfer Agreement. Then I went to the garage, cut the cedar planks to dimension, and stacked them carefully on the third shelf. Preparation and planning are different things. Planning assumes a particular outcome. Preparation controls for as many variables as you can reach and accepts that the outcome will be what the evidence determines. I was preparing. I read the deed transfer agreement for the first time in 18 months on the night of November the 29th. I sat at the kitchen table at 11 at night with the folder open in front of me and a yellow legal pad at my right hand. I read every page. The smell of the paper, the particular dry, slightly acidic smell of legal documents kept in a manila folder for 18 months, is a smell I associate now with the moment a man finally reads the thing he should have read more carefully from the beginning. Section 8, Paragraph 4. The transferees shall not use the subject property as collateral for any financing instrument including, but not limited to mortgage loans, home equity loans, lines of credit, or any other debt obligation secured by the property without the prior written consent of the grantor. Any violation of this provision shall constitute a material breach of this deed transfer agreement and shall entitle the grantor to seek revocation of the transfer in a court of competent jurisdiction. I read that paragraph 4 times. I had not given written consent to any financing instrument. I had not been asked. The overheard phone call, the residency clause, is the complication we deal with. The complication first now had a more specific shape. The way you deal with Section 8, Paragraph 4 is either to remove it or to work around it. Working around it would mean obtaining a signature that appeared to be mine, but was not. I wrote that on the legal pad, dated it, and moved on. At 11:47, my phone buzzed. A text message from Patricia Walsh, Southwestern. Mortgage services. A home equity application associated with my property address. I read the message twice. Then I wrote the name, the company, the date, and the time on the legal pad. Then I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. I did not sleep for the long time. I lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling I had built in 1996, solid and smooth the way I had always built things, and I thought about what happens to a system when someone removes a component they did not understand was load-bearing. The weight does not disappear. It goes somewhere. It always goes somewhere. At 7:07 the following morning I called. Patricia Walsh answered on the second ring. Senior Loan Compliance Officer at Southwestern Mortgage Services, trying to reach me for 11 days. There was an irregularity in a home equity loan application associated with my property address. She said the signature on the application does not match the signature we have on file for you. I asked her which application. She said the one funded 14 months ago. $180,000. I wrote that on the legal pad. I asked where the funds had been disbursed. She said to a business account associated with BPC Holdings, LLC. I wrote that down. I asked where BPC Holdings, LLC was incorporated. She said Delaware. It was incorporated approximately 2 months before the loan application was submitted. I set down my pen. 2 months before the loan application, which meant before the deed transfer was even completed, which meant the instrument that would be used to extract money from my property had been created before my property was legally available to be used. The betrayal of a family's legacy does not require impulse. It requires planning. And this had been planned with the precision of someone who understood that the structural integrity of a scheme depends on the sequence of its foundations. I met Patricia Walsh at 10 that morning. She laid 3 documents on the table: the loan application, the disbursement authorization, and the signature comparison analysis. The signature on page 3 bore my name. But the capital D leaned right. My capital D has leaned left since the 3rd grade. It comes from the way I learned to hold a pen from a teacher who corrected my grip in a way that stayed with me permanently. The capital D on the application leaned right, consistently. Both times. I photographed all 3 documents. I told Patricia Walsh I would be contacting an attorney. She said her fraud team had already flagged the file and would cooperate fully. I drove home. I sat in my truck for a moment and looked at the house, my house, the one I had designed and built and lived in for 30 years. The house whose dad's legacy had been used as collateral for $180,000, without my knowledge, using a signature that was not mine. I took out my phone and called Carol Reyes. She answered personally. I told her it was time sensitive. She had an opening Monday at 2. I said Monday at 2 was fine. Then I went inside and began writing the timeline. The offices of Reyes Property and Family Law were on the 11th floor of a glass tower on North Central Avenue. Carol Reyes was 54 years old, precise in her movements with the particular quality of attention that experienced attorneys develop the ability to read while simultaneously listening. She read my folder for 11 minutes without speaking. When she finished, she drew a vertical line down the center of a fresh sheet of paper. She labeled the left column civil. She labeled the right column federal. Under civil deed, transfer with residency clause pattern of conduct violation of section 8.4, civil action to revoke transfer. Under federal forged grantor signature on mortgage application, mortgage fraud, title 18 FBI jurisdiction. She said, "The civil case is solid enough for me to take on contingency. Arizona courts have revoked gift deeds on less than what you have here." She paused. "The federal matter is outside my jurisdiction, but the documentation you've brought me is exactly what a federal fraud investigation needs to open a formal file." She said she intended to file the civil petition by Friday. I told her I had run a bridge project once early in my career with a 6-week deadline. 40 workers and 3 compromised girders that had to be replaced while the rest of the structure remained in service. I told her we had finished on time. She said, "Then you understand the timeline." I signed the retainer agreement at 2:47 in the afternoon. There is a particular quality to a structural problem once you have correctly identified its source and retained the right people to address it. It does not become smaller, but it becomes workable. The load is the same. The difference is that you now have the correct tools and the correct team and a plan that matches the actual conditions. I intended to get it back. Brooke announced the Thanksgiving dinner on a Sunday evening. 12 guests, a catered menu, a timeline. She delivered this information to Miguel in the kitchen, while I was reading in the living room in a tone that suggested the decisions had already been made. 12 guests. I noted the number and thought about it the way I think about a load distribution problem. 12 points of contact, each one a potential witness. People at a dinner table observe. They hear things. They remember things, particularly when those things are unusual. 12 people in a room during a significant event is not a complication. It is a structural advantage if you understand the load path. The next morning I drove to Maricopa Street Market and bought the ingredients for tamales. I had been buying groceries there for 27 years. The smell of the place, fresh produce and dried chiles, and the faint sweetness of corn masa from the tortilleria at the back was the smell of 27 years of ordinary Saturdays, of a life built in increments, a dad's legacy assembled not from grand gestures, but from 30 servings of tamales made from the same recipe year after year in the same cast-iron skillet. When I got home, there was a text from Carol. Second mortgage confirmed. James's preliminary assessment complete. Call when you can. A second mortgage, which meant the total financing against the property was not $180,000. It was more. I called Carol from the back porch. She told me James had identified a second home equity instrument recorded 9 months ago for $130,000. Same broker account, same LLC recipient. Total combined exposure, $310,000, secured against a property currently valued at approximately $540,000. $310,000. Extracted from the structural foundation of a family's legacy through instruments designed to stay within normal lending parameters, signed with a version of my name that was not mine. Disbursed to a Delaware LLC that had been incorporated before the deed transfer was even complete. I stood on the back porch and looked at the saguaro near the fence. Then I went inside and finished the corn husk preparation. Elena's recipe index card was in the wooden box by the window. The 10-inch cast-iron skillet Elena's mother had given us as a wedding gift in 1989 sat on the lower shelf of the garage rack exactly where it had always been. 7 pounds, seasoned over 35 years. Better now than it was the day we received it. I had 11 days before Thanksgiving. My job was to have the correct materials ready and the correct documentation in order. The corn husks needed 24 hours to soak. That was enough. I was in the kitchen at 4:45 on Thanksgiving morning. The kitchen at that hour had a specific quality of silence, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a space that knows what it is for. The smell of dried corn husks soaking overnight, the faint sweetness of the chile sauce cooling on the stovetop from the previous evening, the clean mineral scent of the desert coming through the small gap at the top of the kitchen window that I had never fully sealed because Elena liked the air. I spread the masa on the first husk the way Elena had taught me, using a motion that starts at the center and moves outward. The masa needs to be even, not thin, not thick, a consistent layer that will cook uniformly. Every tamale a small engineering problem with a known, correct solution. At 7:15, Miguel came downstairs in the clothes he had slept in. He saw the cast-iron skillet on the stove, warming for the chile sauce reheating. He saw Elena's index card propped against the backsplash. He did not say anything for a long time. He said, "I haven't seen that in a while." I said, "It's been here." He refilled his coffee and sat at the table. He did not leave the kitchen. He sat the way he used to sit at the kitchen table when he was a boy, doing homework or reading, or just being in the same room as the person who was making dinner, which Elena had always said was its own kind of conversation. We did not talk much. We did not need to. At 9:30, Brooke came downstairs with the specific energy of a person who has a schedule and intends to execute it. She saw the tamales in the steamer, the cast iron skillet, the index card. She said, "This is a catered dinner, Frank. I've planned the menu." I said, "I know. These are for the guests who want them." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she went to make herself coffee. From upstairs, I could hear Lily's voice, the narrating voice, clear and carrying, describing something she was building in her room. I could not make out the words. I did not need to. The tamales needed 2 more hours. So did I. The first guest arrived at 2:03. 12 load points, distributed through the living room, the kitchen, the hallway, the back porch. Brooke had arranged the catered food on the dining table and the kitchen island individual serving dishes, labeled cards. A visual presentation that communicated a certain kind of effort. The food itself was technically correct. It was also the food of a restaurant kitchen made by people who did not know the people who would eat it, and the room understood the difference. The tamales were in the cast iron pot at the end of the kitchen counter covered with a cloth. Elena's recipe. The same masa, the same chili sauce, the same pork shoulder from Maricopa Street Market. Pastor Harold Williams, 22 years a neighbor, a man who had keys to my house in case of emergency, and who knew the smell of Elena's tamales from 2 decades of Thanksgiving dinners, lifted the cloth, looked inside, and said, "Frank, are these Elena's tamales?" I told him they were Elena's recipe. He took one. He ate it standing at the kitchen counter the way people eat things they want to experience without distraction. Then he said, "That's the real thing." The room shifted. Not dramatically, it was a shift in the way that load shifts in a structure invisible from the outside, but measurable to anyone who knows what to look for. The guests moved toward the kitchen counter. Brooke's management smile held. She redirected 2 guests toward the dining table. But Gerald Patterson, Brooke's father, 61 years old, with the careful grooming of a man who understood the value of surfaces, and who had driven from Dallas that morning, had already moved to the kitchen counter. He took a tamale, ate it, and turned to Brooke with an expression I could not fully read from where I was standing. By 4 o'clock, Brooke was on her 3rd glass of wine. I noted the time. We sat down to dinner at 4:30. Brooke had placed me at the far end of the table, not at the head, but in the position offered to someone whose presence is tolerated rather than centered. I noted the placement without reacting. Placement is information. At 5:15, there was a natural pause in the room, the kind that happens when the first round of eating is complete. Those pauses have a quality of suspension. Everyone slightly satisfied, slightly relaxed, attention dispersed. Brooke chose that moment. She raised her glass and spoke about the house and the future. She used the phrase, family investment. She used the phrase, optimizing the asset. She looked at Gerald Patterson when she said it, and he gave her a small nod. The table was quiet. I set down my fork. I said in the same level tone I use when I am presenting findings at a project review. 18 months ago, I transferred the deed of this house to Miguel and Brooke under a specific agreement. Section 8, Paragraph 4. Of that agreement prohibits use of this property as collateral for any financing instrument without my written consent. The table was very quiet now. I continued. 14 months ago, a home equity loan of $180,000 was secured against this property using a mortgage application bearing my signature. 9 months ago, a second instrument of $130,000 was secured through the same broker account. Both instruments were disbursed to BPC Holdings, LLC, a Delaware company incorporated 2 months before the first loan was filed with Brooke Patterson as managing member. Brooke set down her glass. I did not consent to either instrument. I did not sign either application. The signatures were compared against 6 reference documents, spanning 21 years of my actual signature. In both applications, the capital D leans right. Mine leans left. It has leaned left since the 3rd grade. Gerald Patterson had stopped moving. I have retained an attorney. A civil petition to revoke the deed transfer was filed last Friday. The petition is on the record at Maricopa County Superior Court. A referral has been made to the appropriate federal authority regarding the mortgage applications. I looked at Brooke. I am not saying this in anger. I am saying it because it is accurate, and because accurate information, stated clearly and on the record, is the correct response to what has been done here. I picked up my fork. I intend to get my house back. As of tomorrow, that process is formally underway. 12 people in a room that had been warm and full of conversation a moment ago, now holding the specific silence of people who have heard something that cannot be unheard. Brooke said in a voice that was very controlled, "Frank, maybe people your age should learn to stay in their lane." I set my fork back down. I looked at her across the table, and I smiled. Not the kind of smile she expected. The kind that comes from a man who has already filed the petition, already retained. The attorney already submitted the 412-page appraisal as Exhibit D. The kind that comes from a man who built the table he is sitting at by hand in the house he designed, and constructed himself with a capital D that has leaned left since the 3rd grade, and 6 reference signatures to prove it. I said, "Dinner's over." I walked down the hallway to my bedroom and closed the door. I sent a text to Carol Reyes. The matter has been disclosed at the family dinner. 12 witnesses present. We are ready to proceed. She replied in 4 minutes, understood. Monday morning. Some structures, when they finally fail loudly. Others just stop holding what they were never designed to hold in the first place. I woke at 5:17 the following morning. The house was quiet. In the way it is quiet only in the earliest part of the morning. Not the silence of absence, but the presence of a structure that had held through the night and was still standing. I lay still for a moment and assessed civil petition filed and on record, federal referral made, documentation complete, 12 witnesses present and accounted for. My position in the house unchanged. I got up, dressed, and made coffee. Miguel came out to the back porch wearing the clothes from the previous evening. He had not slept or had slept briefly. He stood near the door with his hands in his pockets. He said, I didn't know about the mortgages. I looked at him. I have made structural assessments for 35 years. I know the difference between a person constructing a statement and a person reporting one. He was reporting one. He said he had not asked enough questions. I said yes. He said, "Is there an us after this?" I looked at the saguaro near the fence, 30 years old, 12 feet of root system invisible beneath the caliche. 2 new arms this spring, each one the result of years of internal preparation that had nothing to do with what was visible from the outside. I said, "I don't know yet." That was the honest answer. The structure between us had been under undisclosed load for an undisclosed period. Those things take time and proper assessment. He went inside. I called Carol at 9. She confirmed the court date, January the 15th. I looked at the young saguaro near the southeast corner of the yard, a new specimen 14 inches tall, doing the majority of its work underground, building a root system through caliche and granite, establishing the infrastructure that would eventually support everything visible. Some structures do their most important work underground before anyone is watching. James Whitfield knocked on my door at 9 on a Saturday morning with a manila folder and a document tube. He had findings I should see in person rather than by email. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. He laid out 3 documents in sequence: the title search, the disbursement records, the BPC Holdings, LLC Certificate of Formation from Delaware. His annotation in the margin formation date preceded first mortgage application by 61 days. Preceded deed transfer execution by 122 days. The LLC had been formed 4 months before the deed transfer was completed, before the house was legally in Brooke and Miguel's name, before Section 8, Paragraph 4 even existed to be violated. I looked at James. He said, "The preparation preceded the opportunity. Someone created the instrument before the property was available to use it." I said, "That is premeditated." He said, "That is the word a court would use." He then set 1 more page on the table. A property comparison report. 2 other properties in Maricopa County. Same pattern. Deed transfers with residency clauses. LLC recipients. Unauthorized mortgage applications. 1 resolved in favor of the original property owner. 1 still pending. He said, "Frank, I've been doing this work for 31 years. The documentation in this case is as clean as I've seen." After he left, I sat at the kitchen table. The stack of folders was now approximately 8 inches tall. 8 inches of documentation, each page a measurement taken correctly and kept accurately. The December afternoon light came through the wide kitchen window at a low angle the way I had designed it to warm horizontal reaching across the full counter. I had calculated that angle in the winter of 1995. Elena had said that might be the most romantic thing you have ever said to me. I heard a car outside. Gerald Patterson stepped out of a rental SUV with Texas plates. I reviewed James's folder in the truck. Then I went inside. Gerald offered $50,000 for me to withdraw the petition and relocate within 90 days. Brooke raised it to $100,000. I said no to both. I set the LLC formation document and the disbursement records on the coffee table beside the cashier's check. I stated the facts: $310,000 disbursed to BPC Holdings, LLC, through 2 forged applications, civil petition on file, federal referral made. I told them to have their attorney contact Carol Reyes. Then I went to my room. Miguel knocked at 6:43 that evening. The 2-tap knock, a small courtesy he had developed since he was a teenager in a house where closed doors were respected. I opened the door. He sat on the chair by the window. I sat on the edge of the bed. He said, "I need to understand what you knew and when." I told him everything, the full timeline. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "You knew all of this before Thanksgiving." I said, "Yes." He was quiet. Then he said, "I'm not a bad person." I said, "I know that." He said, "I'm a person who didn't ask enough questions." I said, "Yes." He accepted that without defense. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I hear you." From down the hallway, in the small voice that carries through walls without effort, Lily asking about the fire station, whether they were going to finish it. Miguel looked at me. I said, "Tell her we'll finish it when things have settled." He relayed the message. Lily's voice came back. She would hold me to that. I said, "I know she will." Brooke came to my door at 8:15 the same evening. She had organized her position and arrived prepared. She said I had misunderstood the situation. She said the financial arrangements had been made in the interest of the family. She said the residency clause had been an oversight. I listened to all of it. Then I said, Section 8, Paragraph 4 does not use the phrase normal financial management. It uses the phrase any financing instrument. Those are not ambiguous words. She said, "Frank, you're going to make this very difficult for everyone." I said, "I'm going to recover my property through the legal process. The difficulty was created by the actions that necessitate that process." She said, "You built this house. I understand that, but you gave it away." I said, "I transferred the deed with conditions. The conditions were violated. The transfer is being revoked. These are the mechanics of what happened. They are not a matter of interpretation." I said, "I am not angry with you, Brooke. Anger is not what is driving this. What is driving this is a documented violation of a legal agreement and the correct legal response to that violation. I do not have a personal grievance. I have a civil petition." She left without responding. I closed the door. I looked at Elena's photograph on the dresser, taken in 2008 on the back porch. Elena in her gardening clothes with the saguaro behind her, squinting slightly in the afternoon sun. She looked like a person who is exactly where she is supposed to be. She would say, "You did it correctly." Documentation is not the same as coldness. The house is still standing. She would be right on all 3 counts. The civil petition had been filed on December the 2nd. The court date was set for January the 15th. That gave me 44 days. I treated those 44 days the way I used to treat the pre-inspection phase of a major build, not as waiting time, but as verification time. Every day had a task. Every task had a deadline. December 8th. Carol confirmed the FBI had opened a formal case file. She used the phrase preliminary inquiry, which in legal language means the threshold of evidence, has been crossed. BPC Holdings, LLC, attempted to make a partial payment to Southwestern Mortgage on the first loan. Patricia Walsh flagged it and forwarded it to the FBI case file. A partial payment after a fraud inquiry begins is not a goodwill gesture. It is an attempt to reduce criminal exposure, and courts read it that way. By the third week of December, I had developed a routine. Morning legal pad review, coffee perimeter walk of the property. Afternoon read or sit on the back porch and watch the saguaros. Evening check on Lily. Leave the hall light on. Lock my bedroom door from the inside, not from fear, but from habit, the way you seal a completed floor before pouring the next one. On December the 22nd, Miguel knocked at 8 in the morning with 2 cups of gas station coffee. Styrofoam cups with plastic lids, the kind we used to drink on job sites when Elena packed the thermos wrong. He did not say anything. He just held one out. I took it. We stood on the back porch for 22 minutes. We did not talk about the case. He asked once if the saguaro near the fence was the same one I had planted in '98. I told him it was. He nodded and looked at it for a long time. When he left, I wrote in my log, some load transfers happen slowly. You do not always see them until the structure shifts. The January 15th court date held. The Maricopa County Superior Court building on West Jefferson Street is made of poured concrete and reflective glass. The facade was a curtain wall system, glass panels suspended from a steel armature, each panel carrying its own weight independently. A well-designed system, nothing leaning on anything it should not. We were called at 10:12. The Honorable Judge Sandra Okafor presided. She was 61, measured in her movements, and read every document placed before her before she spoke. An engineer who reads the spec sheet before touching the materials. Carol presented the civil petition in 4 sections. The deed transfer and residency clause. The first mortgage, $180,000. The second mortgage, $130,000. James Whitfield's 412-page appraisal and forensic title report entered as Exhibit D. Douglas Firth Brooks, attorney, 53 years old, 22 years in practice. A man who specialized in real estate disputes for high net worth clients and who was working with a compromised foundation, requested a 30-day continuance. Judge Okafor denied the motion. She then asked Brooke directly for the record. Did you sign those mortgage applications personally, or did you authorize someone else to do so on your behalf? The room was very quiet. Firth requested a recess to confer with his client. 5 minutes passed. The wood paneling on the far wall had a hairline separation at one of the vertical joints, thermal expansion from decades of temperature cycling. The panel had moved exactly as wood moves under stress. It had nowhere else to go. When court reconvened, Douglas Firth stated that his client would not be answering the question at this time, invoking her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. In the hallway afterward, Carol said 3 words. That was everything. A defendant who invokes the Fifth in a civil hearing does not stop the civil proceeding. But the judge sees it. The judge remembers it. You cannot build a wall over a crack and expect the inspector not to notice. Not much longer. February the 19th arrived the way a scheduled inspection always does, not as a surprise, but as a confirmation. I wore the same gray suit I had worn to Elena's service 11 years ago. Some things you maintain because they matter, not because anyone is watching. Patricia Walsh took the stand. 47 years old, 19 years of experience in mortgage documentation and fraud detection. The quiet authority of someone who has spent 2 decades reading documents that other people hoped no one would read carefully. She confirmed the first application, $180,000, submitted through a broker account, registered to BPC Holdings, LLC. The signature on page 3 did not match the signature on file for Frank Delgado from 2001. She had flagged the discrepancy 11 days before Thanksgiving. The second application, $130,000. Same broker account, same signature irregularity. The analysis used 6 reference signatures spanning 21 years. In all 6, the capital D leaned left. In both mortgage applications, it leaned right, consistently, both times. Firth had no further questions. James Whitfield took the stand. He walked the court through 3 findings. The property appraised at $542,000. The combined liability of $310,000, a loan-to-value ratio of 57%, designed to stay within normal lending parameters. B. PC Holdings, LLC, incorporated 17 months ago. 2 months before the first mortgage application, 4 months before the deed transfer. The sequence consistent with premeditated planning, not opportunistic action. 2 comparable Maricopa County cases, both resolved in favor of the original property owner. Firth cross-examined for 26 minutes. He argued that forming a business entity and later using it for a transaction did not establish intent. James agreed that no single data point established intent. He then listed the data points in sequence: LLC formation deed, transfer first mortgage, second mortgage, disbursement to LLC account, no disclosure to grantor at any stage. He asked Firth if he would like him to repeat them. Firth said that would not be necessary. Judge Okafor said she would issue a written ruling within 30 days. In the hallway, James said, "I've testified on a lot of cases, Frank. The documentation in this one is as clean as I've seen. I drove home on the I-10 windows down despite the February cold. The desert in February is quiet in a specific way, not empty, just resting. Everything below the surface still working. You cannot see any of it from the road, but it is happening. 30 days. I started with the ceiling crack on the morning of February the 20th, not because I had to. The crack was stable, but stable and acceptable are 2 different standards. A structural engineer does not leave a known defect in place simply because it has stopped growing. You document it, you trace it to its source, and you correct it properly. I went to Central Hardware and bought the materials: a laminated veneer lumber beam, joist hangers, structural screws, setting compound fiberglass mesh tape, and a half-gallon of flat ceiling paint in the original color, Navajo white, the same color I had rolled on in 1996. The repair took 2 full days. I set the LVL beam, properly redistributed the load, let the compound cure for 24 hours, sanded, primed, and painted. When I was done, you could not tell there had ever been a crack. Not because I covered it, because I corrected the condition that caused it. There is a difference. Anyone who works with materials long enough learns the difference. On February the 24th, Miguel called at 7 in the morning. 4 sentences. He had retained a family law attorney. He had filed for legal separation. The attorney had advised him that cooperating with the civil case would be in his interest. He wanted me to know directly, not through Carol. I said thank you for telling me. He said I should have done more. I said yes. Then neither of us spoke for a moment, and that was enough. Lily started coming on Friday evenings again, beginning the last week of February. The first Friday she walked in and asked me if the block was still there. I told her I had a new one. She accepted that without further question, the way children accept corrections to the physical world when they trust the person making them. We worked on the fire station that evening. She decided the fire station needed a garden on the roof. I told her rooftop gardens require waterproofing membranes and proper drainage. She looked at me and said, "Okay, but can it still have flowers?" I said it could have flowers. We added flowers. On March the 11th, Carol called at 10:47 in the morning. She said, "Frank, it came. I was standing in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had poured the foundation forms in 1996, where Elena had made coffee every morning for 23 years, where I had crossed items off a legal pad every day since December. I set down my cup. I told Carol to read it to me. She did. Carol read it the way she read everything clearly, without editorial comment, letting the language carry its own weight. The Honorable Sandra Okafor, Superior Court of Arizona, Maricopa County. Civil Case Number CV24-0884. In the matter of Delgado versus Delgado Patterson. Findings of fact and conclusions of law. Finding number 1. The deed transfer contained an enforceable restriction under Section 8, Paragraph 4, prohibiting use of the property as collateral without the written consent of the grantor. That restriction had been violated on 2 separate occasions. Finding number 2. The mortgage applications bearing the grantor's signature had been submitted without the grantor's knowledge or consent. The signature comparison analysis, corroborated by 6 reference documents spanning 21 years, was sufficient to establish that the signatures on both applications were not executed by the grantor. Finding number 3. B. PC Holdings, LLC had received the full proceeds of both mortgage instruments, $310,000 in total, with no portion disbursed to or for the benefit of the grantor. Finding number 4, the pattern of conduct was consistent with a coordinated and premeditated scheme, not isolated financial decision-making. Conclusion of law. Section 1. The deed transfer is hereby revoked in its entirety. Title to the property at 4821 Desert Rose Lane, Phoenix, Arizona, reverts to Frank Delgado, effective the date of this ruling. Conclusion of law. Section 2. B. Peace Holdings, LLC is ordered to satisfy both outstanding mortgage instruments from its own assets within 90 days. Frank Delgado bears no liability for either mortgage obligation. Conclusion of law. Section 3. The defendant is ordered to vacate the property within 60 days of the ruling date. The court further notes that the findings of this civil proceeding have been transmitted to the relevant federal authority for independent review under applicable statutes. Carol paused. Then she said, "Frank, it's a complete ruling, every count." I stood in the kitchen for a moment without speaking. Not because I did not know what to say, because I had already said everything that needed to be said in voice memos, in legal pads, in folders labeled by date, in a 412-page appraisal submitted as Exhibit D. The ruling was not the end of a fight. It was the final inspection report. Everything had been measured. Everything had checked out. I thanked Carol. I set the phone down on the counter. I did not call anyone else. I stood in the kitchen for a few minutes looking at the window above the sink, the wide kitchen window I had designed in 1996 so Elena could watch the desert while she cooked. The light came in at the same angle it always had. Brooke had replaced the curtains, but the window was still mine. The angle was still mine. The light was still mine. I put on my jacket and walked to the backyard. The saguaro near the fence stood at its full height, 31 years of growth rooted 12 feet into the caliche and granite beneath the desert floor. I stood there for a while. The March air carried the particular smell of desert. After a light rain petrichor mixed with creosote, a combination that smells like nothing else on earth. Then I heard a knock at the back door. 2 taps low on the doorframe. I turned around. Lily was standing at the screen door in her yellow pajamas, the ones with the small white stars. She was holding something in both hands, extended toward me, the way children offer things with complete seriousness. It was the oak block, the original one from the 1996, framing the one I had given her in October, the one Brooke had placed in the trash. It was worn smooth on 2 sides from where Lily had been holding it. "Where did you find this?" I asked. She said, "I kept it. I put it in my shoe." I crouched down to her level. I took the block from her hands, turned it over once, and handed it back. "You hold on to that," I said. "That's the foundation piece. You don't give that one away." She nodded and closed her fingers around the block. Some structures, once repaired properly, are stronger at the point of the repair than they ever were before. I stood up, held the screen door open, and said, "Come on, let's go finish the fire station." She went inside ahead of me, already explaining exactly how the roof garden was going to work. I followed her in. Brooke moved out on a Thursday in the first week of April. I walked through the house the way I walk through a completed project before final sign-off. Room by room. Methodical. Starting at the front entry and moving clockwise. The white sofa was gone. On the hardwood floor, 4 small rectangular impressions, where the sofa legs had compressed the wood over 18 months. The floor would recover. Hardwood has memory, but it also has resilience. Given time and a light sanding, the impressions would be gone. Elena's recipe index cards were in the wooden box by the window, undisturbed. I checked each card, all present. The built-in shelving in the study still level after 21 years. The original queen frame I had built from Douglas fir in 2001. Mortise and tenon construction. No hardware, no adhesive, held together entirely by fit and weight. She had used it for 18 months without knowing what it was. I checked the joints. No movement, no separation. On the nightstand, she had left one thing, a folded piece of paper. No salutation. I opened it. A single line written in blue ink. The number was 250,000. No currency symbol, no context, no signature. I did not know if it was a final offer, an acknowledgement, or simply a number she had been carrying and needed to put somewhere before she left. It did not matter. The ruling had already determined what the house was worth to the proceedings. I folded the paper and placed it in my shirt pocket. Carol's call to make, not mine. An engineer does not make decisions outside his scope of work. I sat on the edge of my bed. The house was quiet in the specific way it had been quiet in the years before any of this. Began the presence of a structure that has been through stress and held. The walls were the same walls. The joists were the same joists. The window above the sink caught the afternoon light at the same angle it had caught it for 30 years. I sat there for a while. I did not cross anything off the legal pad. There was nothing left to cross off. Then I got up, went to the kitchen, and made coffee. Miguel knocked at 7:18 on a Tuesday evening in the second week of April. A single knock, deliberate, the kind that announces presence rather than requests permission. He had signed the legal separation documents that morning. He had driven here directly from the attorney's office, then to the dealership, then here. He sat at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, the way he had done since he was a teenager. He asked me the question he had come to ask. He said, "Dad, is there still a place for me here?" He did not mean the house. I looked at him across the table at the grease mark on his cuff at his hands. Around the cup, at the specific way he was sitting, slightly forward weight on his forearms, the way he had always sat at this table since he was 8 years old. Some postures do not change. Some things in a person are structural, not cosmetic. I said, "Come outside for a minute." We went to the back porch. The April evening was cool and clear, the desert air carrying the faint sweetness of something blooming in a neighbor's yard. 3 houses down, a smell that arrived each April and lasted approximately 2 weeks, and that I had been breathing in from this porch for 30 years. I walked to the saguaro near the fence. I told him it was 31 years old. I told him it had taken 12 years to put out its first new arm, and that during those 12 years it had been doing the majority of its work underground, building a root system through caliche and granite. I told him that Elena had asked me once whether I thought it was going to make it. I had told her I did not know. She had said, "You planted it, didn't you?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then you already answered your own question." I said, "I don't know what it looks like yet, the structure between us. I don't know how much load it can carry right now or where the weak points are. That takes time, and it takes testing, and it takes both people showing up consistently." I paused. "But I planted it a long time ago. That part doesn't go away." We stood there for a while without speaking. Then I said something I had not said out loud to anyone since the week after Elena's service 11 years ago. I said her name in a sentence that was not a memory or a reference. I said, "Elena would have known what to say to you right now. She always did. I'm still learning how to do it without her." Miguel looked at me. He did not say anything. He did not need to. We went back inside, and I refilled both cups. We sat at the table until almost 10 o'clock, talking about small things, normal things, the kind of things you talk about when the difficult things have been said and do not need to be repeated. When he left, he stopped at the front door and turned back. He said, "Same time next week." I said, "I'll make coffee." I started with the sofa. The brown leather sofa I had owned for 19 years before Brooke replaced it, 72 inches wide, 32 inches deep. Seat height, 18 inches. I had the dimensions written on an index card. The salesman showed me 4 options. I chose the one closest to the original specification. Brown leather tight back, solid frame, no ornamental stitching. It was delivered Tuesday morning. I sat in it for approximately 40 seconds. It was correct. The Sonoran Desert photograph went back above the sofa on Wednesday. Rehung on the original anchor bolt, still in the wall, still rated for 40 pounds, holding nothing for 18 months. I leveled it with a 4-foot spirit level, 0 deviation. The copper pots came back from the garage shelf on Thursday. Largest to smallest left to right, the arrangement Elena had established in the first year we lived here, and that I had maintained for 23 years after that. The kitchen looked like the kitchen again. On Friday evening, Lily arrived at 5:30. She walked in and said, "The picture came back." I told her it had always been here. I had just put it back where it belonged. She asked if she could help decide where to put the other picture, the one of Elena from the hallway. She held the frame and moved it to 3 different positions along the wall. The third position approximately 64 inches from the floor, centered between the hallway entrance and the bedroom door, she approved. I measured it. 64 inches was 1 inch above standard eye level for a 5'6" adult. Elena's height. I did not tell Lily that. I just marked the wall, set the anchor, and hung the frame. When it was level, Lily stepped back and looked at it. She said, "She looks like she belongs there." I said, "She does." We worked on the fire station after dinner. We installed the roof garden in sequence waterproofing layer, drainage layer, growing medium flowers. When the flowers were in place, Lily assessed the completed structure from multiple angles, the way I had taught her to assess a completed build. She said it was good. Then she said, "Grandpa, can we build something new next time? Not fix something. Build something new." I looked at her, 4 years old, holding the oak block in one hand and a paper flower in the other, standing in a house that had been fought for and restored, and was now in every measurable sense exactly what it should be. I said, "What do you want to build?" She said, "A bridge." I said I knew a few things about bridges. She said, "I know. That's why I'm asking you." I sat down on the floor beside her and said, "All right, let's start with the foundation." The email arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of April at 7:53. The subject line read, "R.E. United States versus Patterson Delgado Disposition Notice." Brooke Patterson Delgado had entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of mortgage fraud under Title 18 of the United States Code, 3 years of federal probation, a financial penalty of $180,000, a restitution order directing the satisfaction of the second mortgage of $130,000 through the assets of BPC Holdings, LLC, a permanent prohibition on serving as a managing member or officer of any financial entity for the duration of the probationary period. The 4th paragraph of Carol's email said, "Frank, this closes the federal matter. I'll send the final billing summary this week. It has been a privilege." I read the email once. Then I printed it, folded it once, and placed it on top of the 11-inch stack of documentation that had been sitting on the kitchen table since December. I found a piece of twine in the kitchen drawer, the same drawer where Elena had kept rubber bands, twist ties, and the small tools that do not belong anywhere specific, but belong everywhere generally, and I tied the stack. I carried it to the study and placed it on the top shelf of the built-in bookcase. The shelf I had installed in 2003, still level after 21 years. In the construction industry, when a project reaches final completion, when all inspections have been passed, all punch list items, resolved, all documentation submitted and accepted, the project manager closes the job file. It does not go in the trash. It goes in the archive. The archive is not a place of defeat or victory. It is where completed work is kept. Accurate, permanent, accessible if anyone ever needs to reference it. That was what the stack was now, archived. I rinsed my cup, found my keys, and drove to Central Hardware on Southern Avenue. The stack was on the shelf. The case was archived. The bridge needed materials. There was work to do. The May evenings in Phoenix arrive slowly. The sun descends by degrees, the light shifting from white to gold to the particular amber that belongs specifically to the Sonoran Desert in late spring, warm and horizontal, and indifferent to everything that has happened beneath it, the way that good light is always indifferent. I had watched this transition from this porch for 30 years. I knew its timing, the way I knew the load tables I had used for 35 years of engineering work, not by looking them up, but by having internalized them so completely that the knowledge had become indistinguishable from instinct. I had been thinking about what I had built, not the house, though the house was part of it. Not the legal case, though, that had required its own kind of structural thinking. I meant the larger inventory, the full project list assessed from the position of a 65-year-old man sitting on a porch he had built himself in a desert he had chosen, watching a sky he had watched for 3 decades. The first thing I had built was the house, every load path calculated, every joint specified, every material chosen for function first and appearance second. I had built it to last 100 years. It was 30 years old, and it had held through everything that had been asked of it. That was not luck. That was specification. The second thing I had built was a family. This one had taken longer, and the calculations had been less precise, and there had been failures I had not anticipated and could not have modeled in advance. Elena and I had 31 years together. What we built in those 31 years was not perfect. It had cracks and settling, and at least 2 periods of significant stress. But we addressed them the same way I address structural problems, directly with the correct materials, without covering them and pretending they were not there. Miguel was the most important thing we built together. He was also, for a long time, the most incomplete. I had made errors in his construction, not from malice, but from the overconfidence of a man who assumed that competency in one domain transfers automatically to others. Engineering skills do not automatically transfer to fathering. I had learned that late. I was still learning it, but he was here on Tuesday evenings drinking coffee at the kitchen table. The structure between us was not finished. It was under active construction. That was enough. The third thing I had built without knowing I was building it was a record. Voice memos and legal pads and folders labeled by date. A 412-page appraisal and a stack of documentation 11 inches tall, now archived on a shelf in the study. I had not set out to build a case. I had set out to understand what was happening. But 35 years of engineering had trained me to document everything, because documentation is not bureaucracy, it is memory, made permanent. When the time came that the record mattered, it was there. Complete, accurate, unimpeachable. Not because I had planned for a fight, because I had always worked that way. The fourth thing, and I had only recently understood this, was the thing I was still in the middle of building with Lily. She was 4 years old. She made decisions about load and span and material with the instinctive seriousness of someone who has not yet learned to doubt her own judgment. She had kept a piece of oak in her shoe for 5 months because she understood without anyone telling her that some things are foundation pieces and you do not give them away. I had not taught her that. She had arrived at it herself. Whatever she was going to build in her life, I did not know its dimensions or its materials or its final form. But she was already learning to start from the foundation. She was already learning to ask the right first question. And I was the one she was asking. That is not a small thing. In the full inventory of a life's work, that is not a small thing at all. I looked at the saguaro. 31 years old, 12 feet of root system invisible beneath the caliche. Elena had asked me once whether I ever worried that it would not make it. I had told her a saguaro that has survived its first 5 years has already done the hardest work. After that, it is not a question of if. It is only a question of how tall. She had smiled at that. The specific smile she reserved for moments when I said something she found both technically correct and unexpectedly true about something other than engineering. I miss that smile every day, but I know what I built, and I know it holds. The amber light was almost gone now. Somewhere inside the house, Lily was narrating the beginning stages of a bridge project to Miguel. I could hear her voice through the screen door, precise, patient, certain of what she wanted. She had my stubbornness, Miguel had told me last week. I told him that is not stubbornness. That is load-bearing conviction. I stood up, picked up my empty cup, and went inside to help with the bridge. I want to speak to you directly for a moment, not as a narrator, not as a character in a story you have been listening to. As a 65-year-old man who has been through something and come out the other side with a few things he knows more clearly than he did before. I am going to tell you 3 of them. The first thing is this documentation is not distrust. It is respect for the truth. When I started keeping voice memos and legal pads and folders labeled by date, I was not preparing for a fight. I was doing what 35 years of engineering had trained me to do: record what is accurate. Keep it somewhere findable. Treat the truth as something worth maintaining. If you are in a situation where something feels wrong, where the foundation beneath a relationship or an agreement or a promise has shifted in a way you cannot quite name, write it down. Date it. Keep it somewhere safe. Not because you are planning to use it, because the act of recording the truth is itself a form of protecting it. A family's legacy is only as durable as the documentation that supports it. The second thing is this: the structure of a person is not the same as the surface of a person. What Brooke did was not impulsive. It was calculated. It was designed to lie with the precision of an architect, a betrayal executed with the structural logic of someone who had studied the load paths and knew exactly which elements to compromise and in which sequence. LLC formation deed. Transfer first mortgage, second mortgage. Premeditated, documented, on the public record. But here is the thing about a betrayal that has been calculated with that much precision. It requires the betrayer to be right about every assumption. It requires the mark to be exactly as passive as expected. It requires the foundation to hold still while the weight is redistributed. I did not hold still. Surface capabilities are not structural ones. What Brooke lacked, what ultimately made the difference, was the thing that holds when the load increases. Integrity is not a personality trait. It is a load-bearing element. And load-bearing elements, when they fail, do not fail gradually. They fail completely. The third thing is this: some structures do their most important work before anyone is watching. The 31 years I spent building a house, raising a son, loving a wife, doing my work carefully and honestly, and without shortcuts, none of that was visible on the day I walked into a courtroom in January. But all of it was present. It was present in the documentation. It was present in the relationships I had maintained, in the way James Whitfield trusted my word enough to run a title search on good faith, in the way Carol Reyes said it had been a privilege, in the way Patricia Walsh flagged an anomaly 11 days before Thanksgiving because the numbers did not match what she knew about how honest people sign their names. You do not build that kind of support in a crisis. You build it over decades in ordinary time by being the kind of person who does the work correctly, even when no one is checking. The foundation is always the most important part. It is also always the least visible. There is one more thing I want to tell you. A few weeks ago, Lily was sitting on the kitchen floor with the oak block in her hands, the original one from the 1996, framing the one she had kept in her shoe for 5 months and returned to me in the backyard on the day the ruling came. She was turning it over and over the way she does when she is thinking, and she asked me what it was made of. I told her it was white oak. I told her it had been part of the frame of this house since before she was born. I told her that white oak is one of the strongest hardwoods in North America. Dense grain, high resistance to splitting, holds a fastener better than almost anything else you can build with. She turned it over one more time. Then she said, "So, it's a good one to keep." I told her yes, it was a very good one to keep. She put it in her pocket and went back to the bridge. I stood in the kitchen for a moment in the light from the wide window above the sink, the window I had designed in 1996, so Elena could watch the desert while she cooked the window that had caught the same light at the same angle for 30 years through everything that had happened in this house. Some things, if you build them right and maintain them honestly and do not give them away, will outlast everything that tries to take them from you. That is what I know. That is what remains. Before you go, I want to ask you something. If you discovered that the home you had built with your own hands, the house that carried your family's history, your wife's pencil mark on the hallway wall, the foundation piece you passed to your granddaughter had been secretly mortgaged behind your back, The deed transferred to people who were already building the instruments to extract its value before the ink was dry. Would you hold still, or would you pick up a pen, open a legal pad, and begin documenting the truth? Leave your answer in the comments. Tell me what city you are watching from. Tell me what you would build if you had to start over. And if this story reached someone who needed to hear it, someone who is holding a structure together right now under load, not sure it will hold, send it to them. Not because it will solve anything, because sometimes the most useful thing is knowing that someone else has been in a comparable situation, and the structure held.